death, rights, and abortion. These are the three themes or topics that we encounter this week. And one of the easiest ways that I know to walk into these kind of topics is to just apply this philosophical pattern of inquiry over the whole set of debates, especially about abortion, and just move in a stage at the time till we reach the articles we're reading this week and the ideas and the various reasons that are in play in those articles. The first thing is we can identify one of the overarching problems or the thing that motivates authors that are writing in the context or talking in the context of abortion debates. That one thing that anybody that enters this debate about abortion is going to encounter is there's no argumentative half measures. They do not work in debates about abortion, and what that means is this half measures avail none. The idea is that, as most will be familiar with, people tend to have fairly strong or rigid or entrenched views or opinions about whether abortions are morally okay or whether it's morally bad, ethically bad. And those views are significantly, like, they're held on tighter in the case of abortion. People are less willing to bend many times when it comes to abortion and whether it's okay to have abortions or not. This is one topic in ethics where there's not a lot of wiggle room with people, is they either say, yeah, it's okay, no, it's not, or it depends on the details. But most people, once they've made up their mind, in order to sway them in an opposite direction or even a little different direction than they're already kind of entrenched in, is extremely difficult. Doing so requires, if that's one's goal, like authors that are writing in the context of these debates, their goal is to present their reasoning, to present their ideas in the hopes that other people may be persuaded to think in those ways or at least be open to alternative possibilities when it comes to issues of the morality of abortion or the notion of what having a right to life means, for example. And so any author that walks into this debate, they have to be very good at what they do if they're presenting argumentation. If they're not, they have zero hope of people actually listening to what they're saying. It's not a matter that an author may not have really good reasoning or really good argumentation. It's that the way they present it and describe it to other people really matters in the context of the abortion debate. And we will see how that works out throughout this video. But I just want to emphasize that the problem that any author or arguer or advocate or just everyday person on the street, when a person is ready to try to convince someone or provide reasons for something to do with abortion, whether it's for or against it or indifferent, that person has to be careful in the way they approach it. Otherwise, a person will be talking a long time, and the audience, the people who are listening, will have tuned out after the very first few seconds. It's a feature of this debate, and so the motivation or the agenda and the motive behind any articles you read on abortion is always going to be to find a way to get around that immediate shutdown of an audience's attention. It's going to be to try to have some argumentative strategy, some argumentative hook that grabs attention and that keeps us focused on what the person is saying, rather than immediately say, well, this person's arguing, they tend to think differently than I do, so I don't listen to what they say. No, the authors are trying to work around that phenomenon. And so that's going to be the big problem that confronts any author in the abortion debate, is how to maintain your audience's attention when your audience, you know that many members are already going to be disposed to not listen to what you're saying. It's a challenge. It's just not like you're walking into a friendly and open audience. Some members will be. But if you want to reach the other members that are not on the same page as you, like in your claims or your reasoning set, you've got to be kind of clever in the way you craft your strategy for presenting your reasoning. And that has its upsides and downsides, as we'll see. You can be too clever for your own good at times in the context of the abortion debate. But that's kind of the problem, how to maintain an audience's attention when a significant portion of those audience members are predisposed to not really want to hear what you have to say. That's a challenge. It faces anybody entering this debate. The question is simple. Really? I mean, it's a very straightforward question that all of the authors we encounter this week are addressing in one way or another. And it's the question that anybody that enters the abortion debate is at least indirectly going to be implying things about. And the question, simple enough, is abortion moral or immoral? Is it ethical or is it unethical? Remember, for our purposes, ethical is the same as moral, immoral is the same as unethical. And so the key question is simple enough. Is it morally okay to have an abortion performed? And, always, some of the time? Do the details matter? Or is it always wrong to do that, regardless of the details? Or maybe in some cases it's okay, some cases it's not. So there's room to maneuver in this question. Even though I've asked it in like an all or a none scenario, there's wiggle in here. So is abortion moral or immoral? No problem. I think we can kind of understand the question. The answers, as I've alluded to, tend to come in three forms with different strength levels. So an answer can be, is abortion moral or immoral? A person can say, yes, abortion is moral. A person can answer this question with, no, abortion is immoral, or it's not morally okay. Or someone could say, maybe abortion is moral or immoral, but it depends on the details of the case. Like, it could depend on various circumstantial features. Maybe sometimes it's moral in certain cases. Maybe it's sometimes morally bad in other cases. We have to look at the specific cases. That's your range of answers, but remember, these things can have different degrees. Like, it can be, yes, abortion is most of the time moral. Or it can be, no, abortion is most of the time immoral. And you leave a little room, an author can. That's what we'll encounter today, is two authors where one of them leans in this affirmative direction, that yes, abortion is moral in certain cases, and it just so happens to be, it's a majority of cases. So it's often morally okay. That's what one author is going to, try to defend. That will be the conclusion she tries to defend. Another author that we'll encounter this week will defend the claim or attempt to offer reasons in support of the claim that abortion is often immoral. Most of the time it's morally bad. There could be some outlier exceptions, but the default assumption is that it's bad. And so we need reasons in support of answers like that. And this is just a sort of summation to give people a sense of how this could go. Is that in terms of reasons, there's a lot of ways that people have tried to defend versions of these, these claims or answers to this overall question. These are the conclusions that people will try to give us reasons for. And there's a variety of ways one can do it. For example, one might attempt to support the claim that abortion is moral via or through a reason like, well, women have a right to choose. We hear that. That's the sort of protester line, is the right to choose. You'll see billboards with that on it. Or one could try to support the claim that abortion is immoral through a reason to the effect of, why is it immoral? Well, because it's a form of murder. And then more reasons are needed to kind of tie murder to immorality, but that's not hard to do. I mean, we can imagine. So someone says, is abortion moral or immoral? Someone says, no, it's immoral. Why? Because it's a form of murder, and murder's immoral. And so there's a nice little, two-step sort of reasoning. Murder's immoral, abortion is murder, therefore abortion is immoral. Easy. It's easy to generate these arguments. I mean, we're already familiar with these. Most everyone in this class will have heard versions of these claims and these kind of patterns of reasoning. So those approaches to reasoning are really not going to do the work that someone might want in the context of the abortion debate. So think about it. If someone is really adamant that abortion is murder and that murder is bad, they're not going to be convinced when someone says, no, abortion's good because people have a right to choose. That's just a deadlock. Neither group is ever going to be able to really communicate effectively because there's no middle ground between those two. There's really no wiggle room. It's like those positions of right to choose abortion versus no right at all to murder. Those are so polar separates that those sorts of approaches, those kind of reasons just typically do not do the work of an author or a person that's trying to walk into this debate and actually say something and people actually pay attention to them. So even though these are common reasons that are offered, if someone wants to actually convince or maybe sway or have their audience to have an open mind about what they're saying, these sort of outright right to choose or murder comments, they don't do that work for that person. And it's just the nature of the debate. Remember, that's alluding back to this problem, is that it takes some crafty argumentative maneuvering to capture a person's attention so they keep listening to what you say once they realize you may be trying to defend something they don't buy into. This is a case in all ethical debates, but in abortion, it's especially important to think before one starts reasoning. In this week, we will look at the reasons and the argumentation offered by Judith Jarvis Thompson and Don Marquis. Or Marquis, however you want to say it. The Thompson, she wrote her article, A Defense of Abortion, is one of the timeless articles. It was written in 1970, 1971. It was prior to the Supreme Court case, Roe v. Wade, and she was very much involved in the hearings and the debates that were leading up to the eventual Roe v. Wade decision, where abortion was essentially legal. There's a lot of procedural steps to go through it, but in this country, it's still legal. And she was one of the trendsetters. She was one of the advocates of the day. And so her claim is that abortion is often moral, that it's morally okay for a person to seek out an abortion in many typical cases. That's the claim that Thompson's going to try to advance throughout her reasoning. And her core reason, like her fundamental reason, that she will come back to and is implied in everything she says, is that women have a right to bodily autonomy that trumps any rights that a fetus may have. It maybe be better to say most any rights, but pretty much it's most any kind of rights that a person might think that a fetus, or prior to birth, the state of an infant prior to being born, that's what the notion of fetus is being used to stand in for, is that even if a fetus has rights, those rights are not strong enough to outweigh this right to bodily autonomy. And it's not just women, it can be women and men alike. or anything in between, that she would say that anyone that's a sort of adult human being has a right to bodily autonomy. And we will talk about what that actually means as we get deeper into this. But that's her core reason. This is like her most fundamental core to all of her argumentation. But it doesn't stand alone. It's the reason that one has to deal with if they want to go against Thompson. But there's a lot of supporting and supplemental ideas around this idea, but it lies at the core of what she's saying. And then Marquis, he claims that abortion is often immoral. And Marquis, he was writing in the late 80s. And his core reason is that abortion is bad, or it's often bad because of what it deprives that person, that potential being of. That it deprives them of a future like ours, or a flow. And we'll talk about that as we go through. But that's their two core reasons. Why is abortion often immoral? Well, for Thompson, because women have a right to bodily autonomy. I mean, that's the super short, condensed version of her article, which, as people read it this week, it's a long article. It's often helpful to have this in mind so that you can keep track of what's going on within it. Now, with Marquis, it is often helpful to just have this notion of why does he think abortion is immoral? What is he always trying to advance? Well, this idea of depriving a living creature of the future it could have, the experiences, the goals, the projects that it could have had were it to have lived, that is a bad thing, and that's what abortion does. So abortion is bad. I mean, that's the sort of overarching reasoning, sort of argumentation structure that's floating across these two articles. But let's go a little deeper. Prior to Thompson and Marquis, before their arguments came about, I mean, Thompson, was writing, much earlier than Marquis. There's about 20 years separation. But so Thompson was the trendsetter. She was out front of this, but Marquis coming behind. But both of them, interestingly enough, that prior to their argumentation, typical abortion arguments, whether anti-abortion, which is against abortion, say, it's immoral, those kind of arguments are reasons to try to support the claim that abortion is immoral. Those are what I refer to as anti-abortion. And then pro-abortion arguments, those are those that offer reasons in support of the claim that abortion is morally okay. They typically focused on this notion of personhood. And it's an extremely complicated concept. It's not immediately obvious what it means to be a person. There's a lot of work that has to go into it, but just structurally, like what did the typical anti-abortion argumentation look like prior to Thompson and then even after her, so prior to Marquis, was this is the structure. And it may seem familiar to some people in here because it still exists, but Thompson and Marquis went a long way to casting doubt on any arguments that take these forms of any abortion argument that rests on the notion of personhood. Thompson and Marquis' argumentation really kind of casts some question into this may not be the way we want to go when we're thinking about abortion. But just to look at the typical structure of an anti-abortion argument would be that all persons have a right to life. Violating a person's right to life is immoral. Well, this is why things like murder are bad. Person has a right to life. Murder violates that right because it gives them death. I mean, just thinking simply about this. And they have a right to live. Someone takes that away from them. Well, you hinder someone's rights or you do something badly to someone's rights. Well, that is bad. So that's why it's immoral. And well, fetuses are persons. Well, from 1 and 3, if you just draw an inference from these three things, you can put together a claim of violating a fetus's right to life is immoral. Yeah, so if all persons have a right to life, fetuses are persons, and violating a person's right to life is immoral, well, then it has to follow. If these three claims are true, then this one would certainly be true, that violating a fetus's right to life is immoral too. Well, the next maneuver would be to say, well, abortion violates a fetus's right to life. Well, why? Well, because abortion's akin to murder. And, well, therefore, abortion's immoral. That's how a typical anti-abortion argument worked. But notice that this argument only works if we have some sense of what it means to be a person. That's this notion of personhood. Like, is everybody that's a human being by default a person? Are you a person just because you're biologically human? As we'll see, that's a little iffy. Personhood's not so easy to gain, that notion. I've said it. I'll explain it in just a second. But the maneuver is to say that all persons have a right to life, and violating such a right is wrong. And then the key move is that number 3, where you say, oh yeah, and fetuses, they actually are persons. So anything you say about persons, you could just as well say about fetuses. And then that's the maneuver that gets you to 4, then to 5, then to the conclusion. Typical anti-abortion argument prior to Thompson and Markey. The pro-abortion argument likewise relied on the notion of personhood. It was that, well, of course, all persons have a right to life. That's the same reason as 1. Using it, no problem. Violating a person's right to life is immoral. That's exactly the same as the anti-abortionist. So there's agreement between these two groups and reasons. But then they differ immediately at 3. Fetuses are not persons. So this is a matter of definition and how one explains what personhood means. These two arguments inherently depend on what one means by that. And so you can probably predict that if the two groups come up, of course they're going to have different conceptions of what it means to be a person. And at that point, they will define personhood in such a way that anti-abortionist is going to define personhood in a very open-ended way, so that fetuses or prior to birth, infants fall under the category of persons. Whereas your pro-abortionist is going to try to define personhood very narrowly, so that it's like adult human beings. Adults, well, a fetus or prior to birth is not an adult, so it's not a person. And so they're not going to agree about what it means to be a person. Well, that's going to be a deadlock all day, every day. Argumentatively, these two groups will not be able to make forward advancement. It's just going to be divisive. And, well, how does this pro-abortion argument proceed? Is that, well, if you go from 1 to 3, then fetuses, well, they don't have a right to life. Why? Because they're not persons, and only persons have that right to life. Well, so abortion doesn't violate anyone's right to life. That's why abortion is not like murder, and therefore abortion is morally okay. And so I would hope that people watching this video at this point, you may be gaining a sense that, like, yeah, maybe there's something not quite satisfactory about this. Maybe these arguments seem good to you. If they do, that's okay. But Thompson and Marquis, they don't buy either of these typical sort of anti-abortion or pro-abortion arguments. They actually, as these words here indicate, they agree that arguments like these that rest on this notion of personhood, they're not very helpful. It's far from obvious what this notion of being a person or personhood means. And given that there's ambiguity about what it means to be a person, not just, legally, but philosophically, ethically, it's not so clear. And so let's get an example of that. Like, in order for such to apply to fetuses, think about it. So the anti-abortionist wants to say that, well, fetuses are persons. Well, I mean, a fetus, tends not to have the abilities of an adult. Typically not. And so in order to say that a fetus is a person, you have to remove a lot of abilities. Like, in order to include fetuses, the notion of personhood wouldn't be able to include things like an ability to reason, like what we're doing in this class. I mean, most people would be willing to admit that even a newborn or a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old would not quite be ready for the level of reasoning we're encountering in this class. I mean, some fully adults may not be ready for some of this style reasoning. It's taxing. It takes a lot of life experience. You have to have an ability to read it too and understand it, reading comprehension skills. Well, a fetus is not necessarily going to have any of that. That's why our kids go to school, for many, many, many years in order to develop the same skill set that we use every day in college, and our regular everyday jobs. But a newborn or a pre-newborn, they don't have those skill sets. So in order to be a person, they have to have the notion of personhood can't rely on an ability to reason, an ability to do math like basic addition, or an ability to understand morality like goods and bads, rights and wrongs. Like most people will admit that they have to raise their children. They teach them the difference between good things to do and bad things to do. Now, it's like children of our species don't seem to enter the world knowing all of these notions, like the notion of rights and entitlements and values. It's like those concepts are not yet there in their minds. Some people could say maybe they are. They just need to be unlocked. But the default assumption is to think that, yeah, human infants come into the world and there's a whole lot that needs to enter into their minds, and a whole lot of life experience is required for a fetus or a newborn to eventuate into and develop into an adult that has these kind of abilities. Well, that's one problem, is that if an anti-abortionist person wants to use the notion of personhood, well, they have to define personhood in some sort of way where it's extremely open-ended. Like, how do you keep out things like cows and pigs and chickens and stuff? Like, in some ways, they've done quite a few lab experiments with the little lab mice and with pigs that they can do problem solving. They seem to be able to do a certain amount of math. Crows seem to have some numeric abilities. I mean, we're not talking about calculus style abilities, but still some counting, keeping track of sums. And that seems to be more than even a human fetus can do. It seems to be, to a lot of people's minds, it would seem to be. And so by stretching the notion of personhood where none of these abilities are required in order to be a person, you may be letting in an individual may be letting in everything. So the notion of personhood may have to be watered so thinly that it really doesn't mean anything anymore. That's one issue with the notion of personhood and putting it inside an argument, is that it's ambiguous. And if you have to stretch it so painfully wide to include a fetus or a prior to birth individual, at that point you may just be letting in every animal on the planet and insects and all kinds of stuff, and they may have more ability than the human fetus. That seems a little strange because we don't typically say that pigs are persons or that cows are persons. We typically don't do that. And so that's one problem if you try to stretch this notion to fit on top of a fetus. Well, it could go the other way around though too. That say you want to stretch it really big, that just being biologically human is good enough to be a person. Well, there's a lot of things that are biologically human, but one of the main things is like human cancer cells. Those are human cells. And nobody seems to have any problem with killing those. We fund and finance all of this cancer research in an effort to try to keep cells from just from some causal things starting to reproduce themselves wildly. And it's like, I mean, we remove those cells, we irradiate our bodies to try to get rid of those cells. We do so much to get rid of these biologically human cells. They're cancer cells. And so what separates the fetus from the cancer cells? I mean, are cancer cells persons? Well, they don't seem to be, but yet they're biologically human. And so that's what the issue is that, yeah, we make a point to a lot of different things that a fetus has, namely it could turn into an adult human being, whereas cancer cells tend not to do that. But it's still, if we have to water the notion of personhood down, we have to make it so thin that biologically humans about all we could say, then we have to figure out a way to say cancer cells aren't humans. And then, well, what happens when a person's body is like overrun with cancer cells? They're still a person, aren't they? Or not? It's just that ambiguity about personhood. And I don't know if I've motivated it enough to let people see that there is some serious argumentative concerns about any arguments that lean on that notion of person. But if I haven't, then it's easy enough. One can do an internet search, go personhood and philosophy, or personhood and ethics, and you will find hundreds of thousands of articles or videos of people talking about this notion and how it's very difficult to get a criteria list of personhood that everybody's going to accept. And it's not a matter of everybody accepting it so much as you can make it too broad, where you can't boot out the cancer cells that we don't want to call persons, or you can make it so narrow that, imagine if we said in order to be a person, you have to be able to do, say, at least algebra, and that you have to be able to at least write a 5-page essay, and that you have to be able to at least do some basic accounting with debits and credits, and to manage a checkbook or a bank account, and that you at least need to know how to drive, and that you at least, you see, at this point, there's a lot of adult human beings that can't do these things. They do exist. And yet, many of those adult human beings, we want to say, yeah, they're persons too, but yet they can't do all those things. So if we narrow or put such heavy adult-focused sort of ability restrictions on what it means to be a person, then we start actually booting out certain people that we would actually still want to consider to be persons. So the notion of personhood can be construed so broadly that you have a hard time telling anybody what the difference between pigs and people are, or it can be defined so narrowly and limited so much that you actually, some people that everybody would want to say, yeah, that's a person, they don't make the cut anymore. That's problematic argumentatively. That's why Thompson and Marquis, they both agree that arguments that include this notion of personhood, arguments of this form, they really do not help us a whole lot with the abortion debate. That's their sort of reasoning, because personhood can be defined too narrowly or too broadly, and we just haven't made sense of a good set of criteria yet that seems to work in all possible imaginable cases. We haven't figured out a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for personhood. So perhaps we need to find another way, some argumentative strategy, some clever way to avoid arguments like this and reasoning like this. And notice that when we do that, we take away a lot of the argumentation that most people will typically be familiar with. That's the neat thing about not going down this road, is that you immediately have the potential for some new way of thinking about abortion. Is that if you remove your ability to use the notion of personhood, you immediately a new world of arguments open. And that's what Thompson and Marquis were trying to do, is to open a new way of thinking about abortion, and they have to do it. They have to be clever to do this and pull it off. Well, with Thompson, so that we can get a sense of those sort of values, disvalues that an author like Thompson has that's just fundamental. She's assuming these things make sense. And, and it's not that she's not going to offer defense of these things, but this is what she will never vary from. Is that in terms of values, what does Thompson most value in terms of our article, A Defense of Abortion, is an agent's ability to control what happens within and to his or her body. That is what bodily autonomy is. It's an ability to control, unimpeded control. Like, if I don't want someone putting something in my body, then I would have the ability to say, no, don't do that. If I don't want a tattoo, people aren't coming to my house forcing me to have a tattoo imprinted on my body. It's an ability to control things like that, to say, no, I don't want a tattoo and don't put one on me. Or no, I don't want to take this medication. Even though you may say it's good for me, it would help my problem. No, I still don't want to put this and ingest this in my body. So I say no. Well, having that sort of control for someone like Thompson is what it means to be any kind of agent. And an agent in the sense of that's the sort of control that we need just to be human. At an adult human level, if a person cannot control what happens within and to their body, if they are forced to take medicines they don't want to take, or to have to take a tattoo even if they don't want it, that's not good. They're not really even an adult human anymore. They've been turned into an object or something less than human, according to Thompson. So she values this ability to control what happens within and to a person's body above most anything else. Why does she value it? Because in her view, or in her mind, if you do not have this basic ability to this level of control, you're not really much of an agent at all. You turn more into an object. Like, what is it that rocks lack? Well, rocks can't control what happens within and to their bodies. Like, a rock can't stop me or you from taking a hammer and smashing it if we so choose. It has no control over what happens within its body. A board that's come from a tree, if we want to nail it to the side of our house, it gets nailed to the side of our house. It has no control over what we decide to do with it, really. And that's the way it is with many, many, many things, objects, not agents, not creatures with minds. So in order to even be a minded creature, a creature with an intelligence, a consciousness, an awareness of its surroundings, you have to have this ability to control what happens within and to your body. According to Thompson, that's like a minimum requirement. And it's tremendously important for Thompson. And so what would be your greatest disvalue in the context of this article is any limits that a group or a lot or one person or many people try to place on that fundamental control. So unless the person voluntarily gives up that control, forcibly taking their control over what happens within and to their body. We're not talking about what happens within and to, say, their house. We all realize that our house is subject to things beyond our control. Like if, say, the government or a state decides to expand the highway in front of our house. Well, they have things known as an easement where they can take some of your yard or maybe force your house to be torn down or moved if they see, if there's some economic plan to put a wider interstate, add 4 lanes to each side of an interstate, and you just happen to live close to that interstate. Well, they may very well just, they will pay you, but you don't really have a choice. You either get paid and your land and your house has to be changed, moved, it's torn down, or you try to fight against it and then you lose. either way, they still put the lanes on the interstate, typically. Not always. There's some people that have been successful against stopping such things, but normally not. Not if the majority. Remember, this is a majority sort of country we live in. It's not an individual makes all the decisions kind of country. And so our house, Thompson's not saying that in order to be an agent, or a minded or intelligent creature, that you have to have an ability to control what happens to your physical dwelling place or your car. It could be repossessed or whatever. It's like, it's not to have that level of control, but it is to have the level of control over your own body. No tattoos if I say no. No medication in me swallowing it unless I say so. No injections or anything like that unless I say so. That is a sort of idea that bodily autonomy, that's the idea of controlling what happens to your body, within it or to it. And that's a big, big value. And any limits that is attempted to be placed on that, Thompson's going to balk at. She's going to argue against. Her argumentative strategy. I've said a lot about how important a strategy is when you're going into an abortion debate. Well, the first part of her strategy we've already seen. Namely, she's not going to rely on personhood. She's not going to do that. And that's the first step in understanding her strategy. How does she the first step into the abortion debate? Is she sort of presents in the article a sort of typical anti-abortion argument, namely an argument that is relevantly similar to this one. And she says, what I'll do is that even if we grant anti-abortion advocates, people who consider abortion to be bad, the claims that fetuses are persons from the moment of conception, as soon as the sperm and the egg, as soon as they mix together, even if we say, yep, that's when personhood starts, and even if we say all fetuses have some form of a right to life, Thompson's going to claim it can still be shown that abortion is totally morally okay in a majority of cases, or that it's often morally okay in a majority of cases. Now, Thompson doesn't personally think that fetuses are persons. Remember, she doesn't buy into this notion of personhood that everybody was slinging around at the time when she entered the debate. Nor does she think that just because something is a person, does it have some form of right to life. Thompson doesn't buy into that either. But her strategy is to say, okay, I'll give you the reasons and claims that you really want, anti-abortion advocate. I'll accept. We'll just assume it's true that fetuses are in fact persons from the very moment they're conceived, and that they have a robust right to life. We'll assume both of those things are true. But even with those reasons, this is Thompson, I will show that you still can't reach the conclusion that abortion is always immoral. So we need to understand that. Thompson's strategy is to give her opponent the strongest reasons at the time that people considered to be the strongest possible reasons you could have for making a case that abortion's bad all the time. Namely, it was thought that if you can have the notion that, as someone would assume it's true, that a fetus is a person from the first moment, and that they have a right to life, that they could easily get to the conclusion that abortion's always immoral. Well, Thompson's going to say, even if I give you those two things, those two big reasons, fetuses are persons and they have a right to life, you still don't have what you need to build a bridge from those ideas all the way down to a claim that abortion's always immoral. It's like those two things do not get you down to that final conclusion. That's her strategy. Is she's going to say, and I'm going to show you why they don't. And in doing that, all that Thompson has to do, what does her strategy, what is it that in order for a strategy to succeed, what is the minimum she has to do? She just has to show that assuming fetuses are persons, assuming that they have a right to life, abortion could still be moral. It could still be moral to abort them. That's what she's got to do in just one case. That's all she needs for her strategy to succeed. She doesn't have to say abortion is moral in every possible imaginable case. That's what makes her strategy and her argumentative tactic quite strong. All she needs is one case where a person says, yeah, abortion looks like it'd be okay. Well, if it's okay once, then it's not always immoral. And so her true opponent is someone who would want to say, that super hardcore anti-abortion person that wants to say abortion's always bad, on it, no exceptions. And Thompson's going to try to say, you're mistaken. That's what she's trying to do. Now, it's a bold argumentative strategy, to say the very least, that she's giving her opponent the best reasons they have, and then still going to push the idea that even if you have those good reasons, you still can't get where you want to go argumentatively. You don't see this strategy. It's not the most common strategy. That's why when we start reading her articles this week, a lot of times people get confused about, what is Thompson doing? Well, this is what she's doing. And it's a kind of convoluted way to get there. Typically what people do is they say, here's how my opponent argues. I'm going to attack these reasons, and if those reasons fail, my opponent's argument fails. It's a direct frontal assault, if you want to use this sort of, militaristic or battle sort of metaphor about argumentation, which it doesn't have to be that way. It's just inquiry at the end of the day, but sometimes it's helpful to think in those terms. It's like, think about a legal case. And that typically a defense attorney doesn't stand up in front of a jury and say, okay, I'm going to give the prosecutor all of this evidence. That, yeah, I'll agree that my client will say all of that evidence is true. Yep, they were there. They had a motive to do this deed. Everything. I'm going to give them all that and then still show you that my client's innocent. That may happen sometimes in courtrooms, but it is rare because it's an extremely risky maneuver. Because if the person who adopts a strategy like this does not succeed, at least in one case, then all they've done is given their opponent the best possible argumentation they can have, and they've not given you any of their own. Because this is a typical kind of what's known as a destructive strategy. You build your opponent up, and then you just beat on them. You don't really offer a lot of positive argumentation on your own. You're just hammering on an opponent's argumentation. And so this strategy typically involves showing how your opponent's reasoning fails. But showing how someone's reasoning fails does not at the same time mean that you're giving any positive reasons of your own, like any reason to buy into your claim. That's a thing just to keep in mind about this kind of strategy. It's a high risk, high reward style strategy. That's why it's not the most common one to see out there. That's why Thompson's article can be a little confusing. But if you just always keep in mind that what she's trying to do in every sentence in the article is in some way offer support for the claim that abortion is not always immoral, you'll tend to be better off making it through the article. Is just always keep in mind that's her core focus, is to say, while abortion may be immoral in some cases, it's not always immoral in all cases. And she's doing that by giving her opponents, she's not arguing whether fetuses actually are persons or not. She says, no, let's assume that's true. She's not saying that fetuses don't have a right to life. She's not saying that at all. She says, sure, assume they do. But even if we assume those two things are true, we still don't get an immediate, clear path to the claim that abortion's always bad. That's what she's up to. I hope those words are helpful. And this plays out in the first 5-6 paragraphs of our article, but it also plays out throughout the whole article. This strategy and seeing it, being able to kind of know about it before you ever start walking too deep into it, tends to be the best way to understand what's going on in the article. So what does she do after she says, okay, anti-abortion person, I'll give you fetuses are persons, they have a right to life. What is her next step? Well, Thompson uses another, a much more common form of argumentation, but never to the extent that she uses it. What makes Thompson's article interesting is, first off, she takes this high risk, high reward style argumentative strategy. Then she takes this common form of argumentation where you argue by analogy, which we'll talk about that, but she takes it to an extreme where she uses analogies on top of analogies on top of analogies. It's these examples that seem really weird and almost sci-fi-esque. And that makes our article even more difficult for people to follow what's going on. And that's the downside to this sort of high risk, high reward strategy. And then you combine it with argument by analogy. So all of these kind of strange cases, these thought experiment cases, that the downside is that it makes it difficult for your readers, for a typical everyday person, to kind of follow what you're saying. Thompson's article has that on its negative side. This doesn't mean her reasoning's flawed. It doesn't mean that her reasoning's unsuccessful. It doesn't mean her reasoning is good. It just means that the mode of presenting it that she has chosen doesn't lend itself to immediate understanding. Your audience immediately understanding what you're saying. That's why I'm saying a whole lot of words here to try to help people understand the big picture. What is she doing? Well, she's going to give her enemies or opponents the reasons they think they won't, and then she's going to use these various analogies and other supplemental reasoning to try to support the idea that abortion is not always bad. That's all she's trying to do. But when you start reading the article, if you get lost and disoriented, come back to this video, come back to this handout, and refresh it in your mind. Like, ask yourself, what is Thompson trying to do again? She's just trying to support the idea that abortion is not always immoral. That's all she's trying to do. And she's using this argumentative structure. It's called argument by analogy to do it. Well, what is argument by analogy? We're actually extremely familiar with this. People use it every day in life. Typically, it goes like this, that you have some phenomena, P, Q, T, whatever you want those things to be. Well, P is relevantly similar to Q. Well, Q has this other characteristic, T. Well, then P will have that characteristic too. And so an example would be that my child is relevantly similar to your child in that they don't make the best decisions in life sometimes. So the idea is, well, my child made a bad decision this week. Well, it's very likely that your child did too. I mean, that's the simple way that argument by analogy works, is we say two things are similar to people, to events, to phenomena in the natural world, and then this one phenomena, it has this other characteristic. Well, then we tend to want to conclude that the other one does too. An example would be that two people that are over the age of 85. So P is over 85, Q's over 85. Well, Q has to take some form of medication due to some health, bodily ailments. Therefore, P probably has to take some form of medication too. It's not 100%, though. Notice that it is possible that P doesn't have to take medication. But is it likely that they do? That's what argument by analogy, that tends to be the strongest it can become typically, is that it's written like I've written or I have written this in, for sort of straightforward, just for the purposes of presentation, that when we say two things are relevantly similar and one of those things has some feature or characteristic, then we say, well, given that the other one's relevantly similar, we expect it to have that same characteristic too. This is used in science all the time. Is like, say that we encounter a virus, a bioscientist encounters a virus that they've never really seen before. But what do they immediately do? Well, they try to look at similarities and compare that virus to other known viruses we're familiar with. And then what they say is, oh yeah, well, this virus we're familiar with, it's susceptible to this kind of chemical drug. That this virus tends to be, it can be beat down really severely, so the body can kind of move it out of the way or put it back in a sort of default recessive state by subjecting this virus to this chemical. Well, given that this virus is relevantly similar to this other one, well, we suspect that subjecting this other unknown virus to the same chemical should have the same effect. And then we try. I mean, this is the motivation for a lot of research in viral, bacteria, life sciences, is that we don't quite understand, like, what is the difference between one bundle of neurons in a brain versus this other bundle of neurons in a brain. But we do know, or it does seem like those two bundles share similarities. And we know that if we interact with this one bundle in a way, it has certain effects. Well, then the suspicion is that, well, if we were to interact with this other bundle in the same way we did with the first one, we should expect similar results. And that's how argument by analogy works in just everyday life and science. It's extremely common. We say that because these two things are similar, if one of them has a feature, then the other one probably does too. But remember, it's that probably does. I've not added the probably here, but it's always there. Argument by analogy is not what's called deductive. It is inductive. It is more science-like, more statistical. It's a probably, a likely. It is plausible that. It's not a therefore has to be. I've written it as a therefore it has to be because it's simpler to talk about it and see it this way. But typically you would insert a probably in front of that. Now, in ethics, how does argument by analogy play out? Well, as one would expect, that these two things, P and Q, they're relevantly similar. Q is moral or it's immoral, whatever it happens to be. Therefore, P is likely moral or immoral too. That's all it is. And Thompson uses this structure over and over and over. It is what underlies every single one of these analogies, these sort of made-up cases. An analogy, remember, is just you say that something is like something else. Something is relevantly similar. That's what an analogy is. That's making an analogy when you say P is relevantly similar to Q. That an example would be that a mechanical example would be something like shock absorbers on cars are relevantly similar to audio filter circuits, and that they both have these low pass, high pass characteristics. I know that may not mean a whole lot to certain people in this, to many people in the class, but we can do that. We can make comparisons off of two totally different systems, like automotive electronics and then automotive suspension systems, that they both tend to pass or restrict, shocks to the system in similar ways. And so we say, well, if we do this over in electronic filter circuits, this is how we make them absorb faster shocks. Well, then maybe we could look for a similar mechanical way to do that over in the automotive suspension system. This stuff's used all the time, this analogy stuff. It's never 100%, but it is very widely used because it's the way, it's an easy way to think about stuff. It's an easy way to see similarities and try to make comparisons. So how does Thompson do this? Okay, so remember the goal, all she needs to do is establish in one of these cases that abortion is not immoral. That's all she needs to do. She just needs one of these many analogy arguments to work. They don't all have to work, just one. If she can get one to work, then she will have support for the claim that abortion is not always immoral. Even assuming that the fetus is a person and even assuming it has a right to life. She wins the day if one of these analogies works. So how do they work? Well, the most famous or infamous of all of her examples, her analogy arguments, is the violinist case. So here's the way Thompson approaches this. She says, imagine that you're in your bed at night. You're not bothering anybody, and you go to sleep. Well, then when you wake up, you're in a totally different location. You're in a new bed at a new place. Say it looks like a hospital scenario. And you went to sleep in your bed at home, you wake up in a hospital. And then as you start to become more alert, you look over and see this person. And you see these tubes running between that person's like side and their belly and your side and your belly. And you're like, what has happened? Now I'm connected to this person. And then about that time, these people come in. There's the Society of Music Lovers. It doesn't matter what society or who the people are, really. It doesn't matter. But she just uses the Society of Music Lovers. And then they inform you that, oh yeah, you were connected to this very famous or very significant violinist expert. This is the best violin player that we've known in a generation. And this violinist, their kidneys were failing. Various parts of their body were failing. And that person, and they were going to die. The violinist was going to die. And we found out by looking at your medical history that you were the most compatible candidate that we had in this area. And so we couldn't let this violinist die. So we scooped you up and hooked you up to him. And unfortunately, you're going to have to be connected to this person for about 9 to 10 months. Or it could be 9 to 10 years. But just say it's 9 to 10 months. You're going to have to be connected to them. You cannot unplug. It would be immoral for you to unplug. Because if you do, they're going to die. And so that's the scenario. You are told that you cannot unplug from the person because it would be immoral for you to do so. Well, Thompson's intuition is to say, no, you should absolutely be able to unplug from that person. Why? Because this is a violation. This is an invasion. Your body. We're talking about a super invasive medical situation that's just plugged in directly into your system, your circulatory system, your respiratory system, your kidney system. You're like fully plugged in. You didn't ask for this. They didn't ask your permission. You didn't invite them to do this. They just came and grabbed you from your house. They kidnapped you in the middle of the night. You go to sleep, you wake up, you're plugged in. You didn't ask for it. You didn't do anything. You didn't invite it. You did nothing. You just went to bed. And then they hook you up and then they say, no, you can't unplug because that person will die. And you got to live like this for 9, 10 months. Thompson's going to say, her intuition is to say, you can absolutely unplug yourself. It is not immoral to unplug in such situations as the violinist case. It's not immoral to unplug. Why? Because it was a violation. It was a violation of your body, your bodily autonomy. They did not ask your permission. That's like them coming into your house and putting a tattoo on you, and you didn't ask for that tattoo. They did worse. They plugged it into your belly. I mean, into your belly, your circulatory system, all of your systems. You're in danger. You could be injured. Who's to say there may not be long-lasting effects like a loss of bone density, a loss of some, all kinds of things could happen in this scenario. This is a very significant biologic sort of, connection that's going on between you and the violinist. But you didn't ask for it. It's a violation. How could it be immoral to unplug? Even if the violinist is going to die, the violation itself to your bodily integrity without your permission is more than enough to say, yep, even if the violinist has some form of right to life, I have a right to my own body. And that's what makes it okay for me to unplug from the violinist. And well, abortions in the cases of rape, are they relevantly similar to violinist cases? Thompson wants to say, well, yes, they are. They are, because it's a violation. And especially if the rape results in a pregnancy, now this person, the idea is, oh, I can't abort because it's a person and it has a right to life, this little fetus. But I didn't ask for it. I was violated. My bodily integrity was compromised without my permission. I did not deserve this nor ask for this. And I would have a right to preserve my bodily integrity in whatever form remains for me. I can't have stopped the rape. That's already happened. I couldn't have stopped being plugged into the violinist. That just happened too. But what I can do is I can stop the violation from continuing. Namely, I can unplug from the violinist or I can abort. And I should be perfectly morally safe in doing that. Why? Because it's a violation to my bodily autonomy. That's the key to it all. It's morally okay to unplug in the violinist example. Well, why? Because it was a violation of your bodily autonomy. And you should be able to reclaim that, shouldn't you? Shouldn't you be able to reclaim your integrity, of your body? And it's your body. And someone's done something with it that you didn't want. You didn't ask for. I mean, it's like just brutally. It's like just so brutal in terms of violating your right to bodily autonomy. And that's why it's okay to unplug in the violinist example, and assuming that abortion or rape, cases of rape and pregnancy that results from rape, assuming that is analogous to the violinist example, then it should be morally okay to abort in rape cases. That's how the argument by analogy works. Is it the violinist example? I've described it to everyone. I've described her reasoning, the supplemental reason behind it. Why is it okay to unplug in the violinist case? Well, because it's a violation of your body. You didn't ask for it, you didn't invite it. Analogously, in rape cases, didn't ask for it, didn't invite it, it's a violation of bodily autonomy. Well, if it's okay for me to unplug, if a person's intuition, when I described the violinist scenario, if your intuition was to say, yeah, I should be able to unplug from that violinist, then you're saying that same intuition should carry over to cases of rape case abortions. It should be, your intuition should say, yeah, you should be able to abort in rape cases too. That's the way the violinist example is supposed to work. Now, is this a good argument by analogy? I don't know. Some people say that it's really great, that it works. Some are not so sure about it. We'll come back to that in the analysis phase of all this. But the key to keep in mind is that that's how argument by analogy works, is that Thompson will give you a scenario, in this case, this sort of strange violinist scenario where you're kidnapped in the middle of the night, you're plugged into someone in this deep, bodily invasive way, you didn't ask for it, and how could they have not violated you? It seems like, and then she's going to say, isn't that the same kind of violation or relevantly similar in all ways that really matter to this rape scenario? And if one thinks that it should be okay to unplug from the violinist, then why wouldn't someone also think it's okay to unplug or abort in the case of pregnancy that resulted from rape? And if Thompson has succeeded, if you now have the sort of, twinkling feeling that, yeah, abortion in the cases of rape is moral, Thompson succeeded. She's won. All she has to do is get one of these through. Keep that in mind. But she may not have. I'm just trying to channel Thompson her reason. I'm not saying that she's right about all this. That's not the purpose, of these weekly videos. Is it's not, all I do is give people material they can think about. And so is Thompson right about this? Does the violinist analogy, is it relevantly similar enough to cases of pregnancy that resulted from a rape? Are those two cases relevantly similar enough to say that if it's okay to unplug in the violinist case, then it should be okay to unplug in the rape case? I don't know, but people will have the opportunity to think about that this week. Her next analogy is this was rape. Abortion cases that are involving a rape, rape, pregnancy, then abortion. In this case, it's a mother's life is at jeopardy.